Right to go. There are 203 active cases of coronavirus in Victoria, with 11 new cases since my update yesterday. 6 of those 11 are linked to known outbreaks and complex cases. 5 are under investigation by our public health team, and there was 1 reclassification. As you know, there have been 809 Victorians pass away as a result of this global pandemic, but I have no new deaths to report today. There are 17 Victorians in hospital. 1 of those 17 is receiving intensive care, and that person is not on a ventilator. A total of 2,795,529 test results have been received since the beginning of the year, which is an increase of 15,298 test results since yesterday. That is a very strong number, and we thank those more than 15,000 Victorians who had symptoms and went and got tested. It is arguably the most important thing that any symptomatic Victorian can do. Go and get tested. Don't delay. Don't wait till this afternoon. Don't wait till tomorrow. Please go and get tested today. That helps us protect you, your family, and it helps us put a public health response around you and your loved ones so that you're not infecting others and ultimately compromising the overall strategy. It's not the detection of a positive case that's the problem. That's exactly what we need. It's about the spread of this virus without us knowing. That's what can set us back. So those numbers are very strong, and we are truly grateful to each and every one of those more than 15,000 Victorians who came forward just a little bit more than 24 hours ago. There's been a lot of talk about regional Victoria, relatively low case numbers, relative stability, but of course we've had the Kilmore challenges. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of those 15,298 tests, the results for which came back today, so tests that were conducted yesterday. 2,360 of those tests were in regional Victoria, so that is a strong number. And indeed, the 14-day period to Monday just gone saw 26,064 tests conducted, results back to us in regional Victoria. So I did want to take this opportunity just to thank every Victorian, of course, who's coming forward to get tested, but particularly those in regional Victoria. We have more than 500 people who have been tested in the Kilmore area. We've got results for about half of those back. There'll be more that will come through the system and will be a feature of tomorrow's update. To the cafe owner, to staff, to every member of the Kilmore community who have come forward, thank you so much, whether it be meticulous record keeping at the cafe all the way through to a really proactive, really strong and impressive performance by the local community to come forward and be tested, as well as many hundreds of people who are being isolated, not just close contacts, but their contacts as well, putting a ring around all of those who may well be positive and may well develop virus. That is no small thing and a very, very impressive achievement. So we thank them very clearly. There are 25 healthcare workers who are active cases. Of course, we also thank all of them and all of their colleagues, many tens of thousands of people who work right across our health system, both public and private, in every part of the state, every hour of the day. We are always grateful to them for their work. In terms of the rolling average, 24 September to 7 October, Metro is 9.7 cases and regional Victoria is just 0.4 cases. In terms of mystery cases to the 5th of October, there are 14 in Metro Melbourne and none in regional Victoria. In terms of that Metro regional split, there are, of the 11 today, there are 2 in regional Victorian local government areas under the 3rd step. There is 1 new case in Mitchell, which is connected to that Kilmore outbreak, and 1 in Mildura. The case in Mildura, though, is a very low positive, and there's been further testing done. Alan can speak to this from a scientific point of view, but we have a high degree of confidence that that will be a false positive, but for the purposes of an abundance of caution, that is counted in our numbers, but we may well see that reclassified as we have reclassifications from time to time. Alan can speak to that in more detail in just a moment. In terms of total active cases across regional Victoria, that is 4, with, of course, that Mildura case being still one that is under review. Active cases in disability facility settings, we still have that one member of staff. Pleasingly, very vulnerable cohorts, so it's impressive that we've just got only the one case, and that has been very stable over recent periods. In terms of aged care, there are 50 active cases that are connected to aged care. That'll be staff as well as residents, and when I say staff, it's the whole range of staff, not simply clinical staff. They are essentially the numbers of the day. I did just want to make a quick comment before I throw to Martin to talk about targeted testing that is going on across the state, but particularly in regional Victoria, whether it be poultry farms just outside Bendigo or other high-risk industries where there's significant movement, where people by the nature of the work need to work in relative close proximity to each other, places where we have seen outbreaks over this global pandemic. We are essentially testing a quarter of that workforce each week. That's all about not only surveillance but also those 3 points. If you test, then you find virus. There's a really imperative to make sure that in those settings where if it went undetected, we know it would spread quite rapidly. And then thirdly, of course, all of those numbers can be aggregated up and give us a more complete picture from a surveillance and sentinel point of view. For those reasons, that program is really important. I think saliva testing is going to be a bigger part of this, following the important validation through a trial with Victoria Police just recently, where 800, 1,000 members participated in that important trial. Martin can speak to that in more detail. But again, we're always grateful to those who come forward, but moving from not just symptomatic testing in community settings, but to symptomatic and, well, hopefully no symptomatic testing, because if you had symptoms you wouldn't be at work, asymptomatic surveillance testing in high-risk workplaces, we continue to get a more complete picture of where this virus is, chains of transmission, how it's spreading, and what the most appropriate public health response to it is. That, of course, coupled with the wastewater testing that has been very important, whether it be Apollo Bay, Anglesey. I think there are 14 different regional water authorities that are partnering with us, together with their equivalents in Melbourne. That is something that's very, very important as well, just to keep a sense of what's out there that we may not know about. Again, I've made the point so many times, but I will make it again. Any symptoms at all, please come forward and get tested. Part of the challenge with this virus is that the symptoms can be so mild that they don't register with people, and that can be the point when you are at your most infectious. So again, being aware of your personal circumstances, being absolutely vigilant that if you feel off in any way, if you've got any of those symptoms that are compatible with this virus, you can't go to work. There's only one place to go, and that's to go and get tested without delay. We're deeply grateful to those who are doing that, and we can't remind people enough, I think, of just how important that is. Testing is one of the most powerful weapons, because it then allows us to put in place a public health response, contact tracing, isolating, monitoring people, keeping people safe, making sure that they've got what they need and making sure they're not giving it to others. It's all very logical, but it all starts with people who've got symptoms, however mild, coming forward and getting tested. As this week has unfolded, indeed as the fortnight has unfolded, the total test performance has got better and better. These are solid numbers. They'll be further bolstered by some of the asymptomatic and sentinel testing, surveillance testing that we're doing, but I just make this final point. That's not an invitation for any symptomatic Victorian not to come forward without delay to get tested. The additional thousands and thousands of tests we'll do in those high-risk workplaces, they're on top of what should be a very high percentage of symptomatic Victorians coming forward to get tested. We're deeply grateful to you. We're impressing upon every single Victorian the importance of this, and we will continue to do that because whilst you've heard me say it many times, it is absolutely one of the most important things, if not the most important thing that any symptomatic Victorian can do. Get tested, and please get tested today. More broadly, this strategy is working. These numbers are coming down, and we've just got to stay the course on this. We've got to defeat this properly so that we can have a 2021 that is COVID normal, that is very, very different to 2020. I know there's a lot of people out there that would like certainty. They'd like all of these things, all these rules off yesterday. We'll take further steps, we'll make further decisions, but they'll all be driven by the science, the data and the doctors. We as a community have got to be as stubborn and as determined as this virus. If we're not, this thing lingers and it is wildly infectious. And if we don't have a determination that is equal to the infectivity of this virus, then we will not beat it. It will sit there and run in the weeks and months ahead. We will have some cases, we will have some outbreaks, but we can't open too early. We can only open when it is safe to do so. I know that's frustrating, I know that's very challenging, but we will have more to say in the days and weeks to come about what the rest of this year looks like. You only get one chance to take these safe and steady steps, and I and all the team, and I think the vast majority of Victorians, are determined to do this in a safe way, in a steady way, so that we aren't pinballing in and out of really onerous restrictions throughout the summer and well into 2021. I'll now ask Martin to speak to some of the testing activity that I've alluded to, and then all of us, including the Deputy Chief Health Officer, are happy to take any questions you have. Yeah, 203.
Thank you, Premier. Testing is our most important tool in beating this virus. And last week, the Premier announced a surveillance testing program in some high-risk industries. And I want to thank those industries for partnering with the government in making sure that they are partners in the safe reopening of their businesses. As the Premier indicated, we are rolling that program out this week in fish, poultry, abattoirs, warehousing, those areas that the data tells us have been high-risk areas for this virus to spread. And I want to thank the employers, I want to thank the workers, and I want to thank our frontline local public health units who are out there doing the work to make sure that our testing is targeted and effective. As the Premier indicated, over the last few weeks, the Doherty Institute and the government have been trialling a saliva test, still a PCR-based test as per the nasal, more intrusive program. This test, which I'll let Alan talk to the science about perhaps, is less invasive, and we've seen it trialled in Bendigo, the Central City and Dandenong, and it's looking very good. So as part of the targeted surveillance testing that is now underway, we'll be rolling that program out at Hazeldene's Poultry on the outskirts of Bendigo. That will be less intrusive, but as equally as effective as the current standard PCR test. So that will be an important further innovative tool that will allow our crack local public health testing officials and teams to get out into those workplaces, stay ahead of this virus and deliver the data, the science and the measuring of how this virus presents in our communities. And with that data, we then move to the next stages where we do identify outbreaks with an ever improving contact tracing and isolation process. That's how we're going to stay ahead of this virus. That's how we're going to have a COVID-safe 2021. And I want to thank the Doherty Institute. I want to thank Victoria Police, almost 1,000 members of Victoria Police who worked with the Doherty to make sure that this process was ready to go. And I want to thank those targeted industries and their workforces for the opportunities of making sure that we keep their workplaces safe and open through this process. And I should also thank very much the people of the Kilmore community who have come forward in extraordinary numbers with extraordinary community resolve to make sure that the small outbreak so far in their community is contained, and that extra ring of certainty of the contacts also being isolated. The Kilmore community has done an outstanding job. All Victorians have done an outstanding job in the sacrifices and the efforts they have made. So I suppose I just finished by reinforcing how important testing is. Testing for symptomatic cases with even the mildest of testing, even the mildest of symptoms. Come forward to over the 200 testing sites around the state. If you've had your test, wait at home until you get your response from the officials. That is now almost certainly within 24 hours. Increasingly, it's within a few short hours. That then gives you the certainty you have to make sure that you are safe to participate within the rules of our Victorian community. But the next step, the targeted surveillance testing for asymptomatic workplaces, is even that next level of certainty and protection. So testing provides us that critical tool in safely reopening. Make sure that if you're in those workplaces, you participate, and we make sure that the new saliva rollout of this system will make it easier for you to participate in that surveillance testing. We're hopeful that that will increasingly become part of the options that our testing teams will have right across the state, probably by the end of the year. I'm happy to let Alan speak about the science on those kind of approaches, and I'll probably throw to Alan just to talk about the numbers of the day in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. I might just take the opportunity to explain how this testing works, how PCR works. So everyone's probably heard of DNA. So that's the sort of the book of life, the genetic code within all our cells, and humans have 9 billion letters, as it were. Viruses obviously much simpler, and they have 29,903 for SARS, and which is really amazing when you think about it. That 29,000 letters has caused all this pain and misery across the world. So a PCR works by targeting a small segment of that sequence and amplifying it. So it goes through amplification cycles, and this is what we call the cycle threshold. So when we can detect it, we get to a point that we can detect the virus, and then we know that it's specific to that virus, so that's a positive test. If it doesn't take many cycles to amplify the virus before you can detect it, there must have been a lot there to start with. If if it takes a lot of cycles to get a positive result, then we can conclude that there probably wasn't a lot there to start with. It's not an exact quantitation, but it is an indication. So false positive tests, one of the things we can tell sometimes when they're false positive is sometimes when it takes lots and lots of cycles to get a positive result, so over 40 cycles, then we say that's probably going to be a positive test. They're actually, in most tests, there are actually two targets, so there's two sequences of letters. If only one of them is positive, then that's also an indication that it might be a false positive test. So the case in Mildura, it took 42 cycles to amplify, to get a positive result. That's a pretty low positive. So then the next step is to go and test on another machine to see that if it is positive, and then it's sent to the reference laboratory, Vidwell, for confirmation. So obviously we want to be very, very careful that, if it's we're going to call it a false positive, that actually it is. So that's why we go through these additional testing steps to make sure. With the saliva test, in the past, there had been concern that there wasn't as much virus present in saliva as there was when you take a nasal swab. But obviously the Doherty and other researchers around the world have been refining that, and now it's probably fairly equal, so that we can get equivalent results from saliva as for a nasal test. So that's sort of the background to how that works.
How long does it take to get the results back from the Doherty saliva test?
So it's the same time that it does. It's the same PCR test. It's just a different sample that goes into the machine.
So why did you decide to go with this particular test and none of the antigen tests that have been approved by the TGA?
So the antigen tests. So they've been looked at the moment. So antigen tests are completely different technology. So they're not PCRs and they don't amplify up genetic code. They're looking for sort of the surface of the virus, as it were. They probably aren't quite ready for prime time. We really want to make sure that they work, and antigen tests are used for other things, so influenza, for example, and in general they're not as sensitive, and if it's only a little bit less sensitive, we would accept that. But for example, some flu tests, and certainly back probably using previous technology, the sensitivity was 50%, which meant that of all the people that had flu, the test would only be positive in about half the time. So that's probably not acceptable performance, and we really want to make sure that these tests perform as well before we deploy them
Do you know how
widely.
good the ones are in Europe and America? They seem to be using a lot of antigen tests. Do we know how good their error rate is?
So like with the antibody tests, there's quite a lot of these tests out there. The ones that and of varying availability. So some of them that, for example, that are used in Europe and America actually aren't available here. And they vary in test performance. So it is very much you have to look at the each test and evaluate them each of them as they come through to make sure that they perform as well as they say they do.
Do you know, or do you think the Chadstone cluster is contained?
Look, I think we only know what we know. There weren't any new cases from Chadstone yesterday, so we have a total of 31 cases. We're still looking, so there's all the shops are getting door knocked and encouraged to get tested, and really thank all the Chadstone shops for participating in that. And there's also the clinics for symptomatic people who may have been customers during that time.
And I'm just wondering what might happen next time, because on the Wednesday the truck driver goes to Kilmore, comes home, and I'm told the household member says to the truck driver when he gets home, household member works at the butcher, I tested positive. So I just wonder, do you know how much the people at the butcher shop were being told by the health department on that Wednesday?
I don't know the exact timings of exactly who was told what when, but we can only follow up things that we know, and so
Yes.
there are obviously delays in the system. It still takes a number of hours to do a test. We still need to get the contact details and so on. And
I
call
guess I'm
everyone up
asking in terms of the contacts of contacts, both what happened then and what might happen, because there's going to be another one, isn't there, sadly?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for example, in Kilmore, we're taking a very aggressive approach, and it really does depend on the situation at the time. So, for example, in Kilmore, we are taking. I think there's confusion whether we call it the third ring or the second ring, but the contacts of contacts are being asked to isolate, and that's really trying a precautionary approach, really trying to take, to put a ring around the outbreak. I think it's certainly something that we consider in other settings, but it really depends on what the situation looks
So do we
like.
know on what day the health department first realised there was a positive test from somebody who worked at the butcher? Do we know if that was before Wednesday?
I'll have to get back to you on the dates. I don't know the exact dates.
How much does the Kilmore cluster total now?
Sorry.
How many cases are in the Kilmore cluster now?
So there are 4 official cases, and one of those is the person from Chadstone that went up to Kilmore. We are aware that there is probably a 5th case, and we're just looking into that at the moment.
Is Chadstone considered low risk now, that cluster?
Look, I think we still encourage everyone to participate in the testing, so both staff and customers that have been there. I think the dates are from the 30th of September to the 3rd of October. So I think there weren't any cases reported yesterday. We would expect there may still be ongoing cases, but hopefully in people that we've identified as and are in quarantine already.
How are we tracking in terms of where you thought we'd be? Have we sort of gone backwards a bit? We were looking toward October 26, and it was brought forward to October 19. Have we gone back to that October 26 now?
Look, I think it's really going to be a day-by-day assessment of the situation. I think at this stage, so the average in metropolitan Melbourne has dropped into single figures, so it's below 10. And in some ways, I'm a little bit less worried about that figure than I am about the unknown source cases. So there are 14 unknown source cases in the 14-day window. 8 of those cases are actually between the 22nd and the 24th of September, so in the next 3 days they will drop out of that window. But there are still 6 cases between the 30th of September and the 4th of October, and they, every unknown source case obviously represents at least one person who gave it to them. So we still are concerned about that, and that's, I think, the figure that worries me most at this stage. But we still have a little way to go, so I think we just need to keep an eye on those and to continue to investigate those to see where they might have got it from.
Is there a concern about numbers sort of maybe plateauing a little bit? I know they've gone up and down this week. They've sort of been single figure, then double figure, but Is that a concern of yours?
Look, I think it's less about the actual number than what the situation is. So obviously we've had the outbreak at Chadstone, Kilmore. These numbers are still adding to the total, but in some ways I'm more comfortable about those cases because most of those have arisen in household members, for example, where they're under quarantine and they're close contacts. So it really is the unknown source cases that I'm most worried about at this stage.
Are any of those mystery cases because people aren't cooperating, or are they?
I don't think so. I think of those 6 cases, particularly from recently, I understand they have been cooperating, but obviously we don't know what we don't know. So, and we're always going back to them to double check. And I think probably one example is in the Frankston households there were 3 new cases diagnosed yesterday from there, and they actually link those 2 households together. So that actually provides the link and fills in some of those missing gaps, which is reassuring to some degree. So again, having new cases isn't always a bad thing. It might obviously it's not good for the people, but from a public health point of view, it does provide us with a little bit of reassurance that we have links between clusters.
And have you been able to close out any of those mystery cases that we were talking about last week? I think there was one in East Malvern, East Caulfield, Oak Park, those sort of.
So I haven't got those ones, but certainly I know that on the 25th of September there was an unknown case that was the source was found for that, so that now no longer counts as an unknown source case. But I haven't got the exact details of these last 6.
Just on the context of contacts, let's just say next week a butcher shop, like 6 people work in a butcher shop. If one of them goes and gets a test on the Monday and gets a result on the Monday evening, what would happen on the Tuesday? I assume all of the staff they work with would be told, but what's going to be the practice going forward? How many people would then be asked to stay home and monitor or get tested?
Look, it really depends on the situation. So if on the Monday they said I got sick on a couple of hours ago and I got a test immediately, and there's not a long or they hadn't been at work, for example, over the last 2 days, or they'd just been at work the previous day, then obviously we would trace their close contacts and test them, and then depending on those results work out what to do. So if there were a lot of those people had been, if there were 6 people at the shop and a lot of those were positive, then actually that probably means something's going on. There's already been transmission. We would take a pretty aggressive approach.
Does that mean you don't do the contacts of contacts unless there's more than one positive?
It really depends on the assessment of the situation. So if that person had been infectious for a week and had been at work a week, then we would take a more aggressive approach in that situation. So it's not a one-size-fits-all in that sense.
Just with that Mildura case that you're expecting to be a false positive, was that a local or was that a permitted worker in the region?
I understand it's a local at the hospital. Yeah.
Alan, just for the people watching, everyone's watching these numbers very closely. Are you able to explain broadly why, as the numbers get lower, the sort of drop in numbers seems to slow?
So I think I've tried to make this point a few times before, that it really is about, when we get down to these sorts of numbers, chance plays a huge role. So who are the last people to get this infection? If they happen to be people that are, for example, close contacts, or they're people that are working from home, live alone, haven't been out much, then they won't transmit to anyone, and that things will would resolve very quickly. But if they happen to be, someone who works in a permitted industry, but they might have been sick for a few days, they thought, the symptoms were hay fever or something, didn't get a test immediately, resulted in a lot of exposures, had a lot of contacts, live in large households, for example, then that there's a potential for what we call a super spreading event, and things can get out of hand very quickly. So it isn't always the fault of the person. It's sometimes people spread infection when they don't know that they're infectious. They're not symptomatic yet, and that chance plays a very increasingly large role in determining sort of what happens after this.
At one stage last week, mystery cases were spread across 14 local government areas. Do you know the number that we're at now, and is that still a concern?
So I only have the ones for that last 6, which obviously the 8 will probably drop off the system soon. So the most recent 2 are in Dandenong and Altona North. So that's 3175 and 3025 as the postcodes. And then the other ones are in Blackburn, Wyndham, Moreland and Maribyrnong. So anyone in those areas, if they're in any way symptomatic, it'd be great if they could come forward for testing and just make sure that there's nothing circulating outside of that.
Sorry, Alan, could you just repeat those suburbs again, sorry?
Yep, so it's so Dandenong and Altona North, Blackburn, Wyndham, Moreland and Maribyrnong. Yep.
Alan, have you rerun the modelling any time recently on what date we could hit that 5-case threshold and what date step 3 could be activated?
At this stage, it really is going to just look, it's going to be an assessment of the situation. The models aren't really going to help us for this sort of question about when we might hit thresholds. It actually isn't, a hard number that we're going for. It is about what does the situation look like. So if we didn't have any unknown cases, the threshold that we would be at the moment with 9 cases would actually probably look pretty good, even though it's above the 5. But having these unknown cases is the sort of factor that makes me worry a little bit more.
And I just want to clarify again how it works. The listing of the Chadstone as a site that week before, does that mean everybody who went there should come forward even if they don't have a symptom? So is that in effect asymptomatic testing of people who might have been customers at the butchers or not?
No, so it's symptomatic testing of customers.
Right.
We're doing asymptomatic testing of workers at.
And can I ask why that decision? Why not test asymptomatic customers there, but asymptomatic customers in Kilmore?
It's to do with partly to do with numbers. And the level of risk that we think that workers are at compared to customers.
So there'd be too many customers to test, or?
No, I think we want to target testing to where the risk is highest, and there's certainly been more cases in staff than in customers. Yeah.
Alan, with the tracing effort in Kilmore, we're getting reports of people being told at the point of tracing that they needed to isolate for 14 days regardless, and then phone calls from DHS a little bit later on saying when the test comes back negative, forget about isolating, you're fine. Are we confident that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet when they're giving people advice at testing and phone call stages?
Yeah, so I'll have to check as to what advice was given to people in Kilmore. It is the case sometimes that information changes, and then people that we, for example, might have not thought were close contact. On further information, we get they become close contacts, and therefore the advice to them changes. So I'll have to look into exactly what advice is being given to people in Kilmore.
What should people do? They're identified as close contact. They go and get the test. Should they isolate for 14 days, or should they wait until the test comes back?
Yeah, so it really depends on. They basically need to follow whatever the instructions they've been given, and recognising that may change depending on other people's results and further information. So again, I'm not sure exactly what they've been told there, and I'll have to look into that a bit more.
Do you know what the rule is like if you're a customer there? What's the rule if you're a customer?
So customers who have been there between the 30th and the 3rd, if they are in any way symptomatic, they're all regarded as close contacts, so they all should quarantine and follow instructions about testing, and obviously get tested if they become symptomatic.
Professor Cheng, if we are to have no more new mystery cases, what will that figure be at come the 18th?
So again, it really depends on what the situation looks like. So if we, if the 5 or 6 or even 7 cases are sort of towards, the remote end of the 14-day window, I'd probably be a lot more happier than if they were sort of much more recent to that date. So it really depends on where they are and what they look like.
Given we've had 2 more though overnight, it's probably not likely we're going to be getting near that 5 benchmark, is it though?
Oh, look, I think we just need to look at the figures every day. It's, I think as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, this is an unpredictable disease, and we're doing our best to try and close out where these mystery cases are coming from.
And is the Frankston case that's now across 2 households, is that linked to the Chadstone outbreak?
So not the new cases. They're in children, or one of them, 2 of them in children. Yeah.
Okay, but the initial Frankston outbreak was linked to Chadstone?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And is it now linked to another cluster? Did you say there were more cases for Frankston?
So Frankston has 11 cases.
Yeah.
One of those cases is linked to Chadstone. Chadstone has 31 cases, and one of those is the Frankston case, and the other one is Kilmore. Yep.
And do you think with numbers this low, I know you get asked this a bit, but is the 5K limit effective if numbers are this low? Is it making a difference at the moment?
Look, I think it's hard to know what is out there, but it certainly is an effective measure to reduce aggregate movement. So, I think we all saw what happened on the beaches, and obviously I don't know what proportion of the people on the beaches lived within 5K of the beach, but you could imagine what it would look like if there wasn't a 5K limit. Half of Melbourne would be at the beach, and they would be interacting there. So I guess that's sort of the reason for that at this stage anyway.
So even with numbers this low, you still think 5K is effective?
At this stage, yes. Yeah.
And is there a chance that regional Victoria could move even further ahead, given that apart from around Kilmore, they're tracking really well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why there's still restrictions, obviously, in the regions, even though they haven't had many cases, is a situation like Kilmore, or further ago further back in Colac, where these regions can be seeded by cases from Melbourne. I think we're always looking into, what tweaks can be made, and whether there might be things that can be done in the regions to tweak it. But there still will be some restrictions, particularly while Melbourne has active cases like we have at the moment.
So with a handbrake.
It is, yeah. Yep. So I guess it's like a fire break to say that it isn't going to take off there if an ember seeded there.
Can we just ask the Premier about some of the numbers? I think we'd need to be at 3.1 cases every day from now to the 19th to reach the benchmark. Should people steel themselves for no change on the 19th?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think what Alan's just said to you and what I've said over many, many weeks and months is that numbers are critically important, but the narrative that sits behind those numbers is a really important part of this too. If they're cases that are contained, if they're cases that we have a really clear sense of what the chain of transmission look like, and if we're confident in the public health response that we've wrapped around those cases, then numbers at this low level are just one part of it. That's why mystery cases, because you can't have that confidence about have you actually contained it, because you can't work out how the person got it. There's got to be at least one other person who gave it to them. They've got close contacts. Their close contacts have in turn contacts. I think that the logic tells you that when you get down to these low numbers, it's not just a quantitative exercise, it's a qualitative one as well. And that's challenging. The point Alan has made many, many times, chance does play a really large part in this. That's the counterintuitive thing here. Coming forward and getting tested and being a positive is actually far, far better than not coming forward. And then we finish up with mystery cases further along, and you can be part of a chain of transmission that is much, much bigger than if you had come forward and been, as a person with symptoms, to get tested as close to when those symptoms began as possible. What's called exposure days, the number of days that you had symptoms or had virus and didn't get tested, each and every day we've got to keep reducing that so it gets down to the smallest amount of time possible. So I know so much of these morning briefings are about reinforcing really important messages, and I'll again say it, if you've got symptoms, do not delay till this afternoon. Most definitely do not delay until tomorrow or the day after. Go and get tested today. Even if you're positive, getting tested quickly, that is a good thing. That will help us deliver this strategy. It will in no way compromise this strategy if we've got people coming forward and getting tested as soon as they've got even the most mild symptoms. That's a really, really important message. And the good thing about it is these numbers remain solid, very solid. And if you look at other parts of the country, they're grappling with pretty steep decreases, pretty steep decline in the number of tests that they've been doing. And so we're all out there calling for more and more people to get tested.
Premier, are you considering potentially not just going to an entire next step out of lockdown, but a sort of midway step?
I can't rule out anything really. We're looking at all of those different options. What we can be clear about though is that the data and the science of this, but also those stories, the kind of qualitative stuff, the narrative that sits behind those numbers will guide us as we get closer to the 18th, and indeed in the steps that will occur after that.
So even if Melburnians, are sort of thinking that there's a bit of doubt about getting to that next step, there should be some reward come October 18th.
Well, we certainly will look to make as many changes as we safely can. So it's very difficult, as I've said many times, to be able to predict where we'll be tomorrow, let alone in another 10 or so days' time, indeed longer than that. But whatever we can give back, whatever we can loosen, then of course we will, but safety has to guide us. And having come this far in what's been a very painful, very long journey, I think that despite the frustrations, understandably, of the many, many Victorians, the overwhelming majority of Victorians want us to do this properly. And for the sake of some days, that's simply not worth throwing away everything that we've been able to build. Mystery cases are the key at the moment, and that's why, looking both downstream as well as back upstream to try and close out those cases and have them not as a mystery but as a case where we know where it came from, that's something that the public health team are very much focused on.
If you were to provide some changes, would you be likely to look at social restrictions such as the 5K rule, such as the gathering numbers, or businesses reopening?
I fully appreciate why the question's asked, absolutely, but I cannot speculate about what those changes might be. What I can do though is say what we'll be guided by, and that's the public health advice, not just the data though, but what sits behind that, and we're looking at everything. And we'll have further announcements, which I know everyone would love me to make today, but if I made them today, they wouldn't be based on the best advice, they wouldn't be based on data, and they would be anything but safe. The best and most important thing to do is to wait these next few days till we get to the 18th, and then make a call at that point. And I just want to reassure Victorians that everything is on the table, but only those things that are safe will be chosen. There's just no other way.
How long will you be trialling this third ring approach before it becomes this?
Look, I think it'll be, well, it's been trialled a bit already in the last week or so, maybe even a little bit longer. It's a case-by-case basis, so it's about where you think you'll get the maximum benefit, where the maximum reward will be. And it particularly relates to if you've got a large number of people who have been, whether it be against the international the case definition of 15 minutes face-to-face or 2 hours in the same room, that could be a guide. So in a cafe, for instance, where you've had a large number of people that would, if they didn't fit that criteria, they'd be pretty close. They all live in households. It's a proportionate response to what you're dealing with. But you can't say you'll employ that everywhere, because there may well be other outbreaks where there might, for instance, the example Alan used, Raf's issue around the butcher shop. There could be 50 staff at that particular butcher shop, but the person who's tested positive wasn't at work for the 3 days before they tested positive, so you wouldn't necessarily employ it there. So where it's seen as being of significant benefit, then it'll be cases, close contacts and their contacts, but that wouldn't necessarily mean every single case led us to do that.
But given we're trying to snuff this out, wouldn't it make sense to close the butcher shop for 2 days while those, say, 50 staff did get tested, just to reassure yourself?
Well, I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of what occurred at the butcher shop. There wasn't one deep clean, there was two. So there was a period where they were open again. We went back and double checked, and there was a need. It was a minor matter, I think, but there was not a degree of satisfaction with one element of that cleaning. So they closed again, they cleaned again, and then they reopened. This has been an exemplary response, is the advice I have, and we're grateful to the shop owner, who I understand is the manager, who I understand is quite unwell, and we send our best wishes to him and to his loved ones. What I'm saying, Lundy, is it may well be, because of the nature of the cases we have to deal with in the weeks and months ahead, that we do employ this everywhere. But I'm just being as clear as I can to say for some cases it may not be a proportionate approach, and therefore we won't do it. Wherever it's needed, wherever we think it'll get us a benefit, then that's exactly what we'll do.
Premier, why the back down on the omnibus bill yesterday?
Well, we have negotiations in good faith with the crossbench, and we're about getting things done. And if it's clear that you're not going to get the numbers for a particular provision, then deal with that, move on. The Attorney-General has spoken, I think, in some detail about the nature of those changes. We still commend the bill in its amended form to all members of Parliament, because there are some very important provisions that relate to that interim. They need to be extended out until April, because this thing's going to be with us until April, hopefully in a very different set of circumstances by then.
But do you believe fundamentally that there should have been a power for authorised officers to detain, sorry, to finish the question, to detain anyone based on a belief that they may break the rules?
Well, there are debates that are relevant, and then there are debates that are purely academic, and given that those matters have been taken out of the bill, I probably can't add any more to the comments I've already made. I've answered that question, but the bill doesn't include those provisions. So
your view has changed, or do you still believe that?
Well,
those
my view has always been,
detained?
Simon, that if you want to make laws, you've got to get a majority of votes, and it's clear that there wasn't a majority of votes. We're grateful for the engagement we have with the crossbench. There's no point having a quarrel if you're not going to get the outcome you want. Change the bill, move on. That's exactly what we've done.
Just sort of
Nothing more, nothing less than that.
back to what I was asking Alan about
Sure.
regional Victoria.
Yes.
What's the next step likely to look like for them?
Yeah, look, this is a really challenging one, and I did a regional, similar virtual version of this with a number of regional journalists, myself and Jerome as testing commander this morning. And what I said to them was, this is a really challenging set of circumstances. You want, as best you can, as quick as you can, to have an alignment between metropolitan Melbourne and regional Victoria in terms of the rules, because that's what will allow you to have more freedom of movement. And I don't think there's a regional tourism business that wouldn't think that was a good thing to do. I don't think that there's a family in regional Victoria who want to visit a loved one in metro Melbourne or vice versa that wouldn't think that was a good thing to do. But if the tail of this in Melbourne is more stubborn than we thought, I'm not saying that it is, but if it were the case, or do it in the more positive sense, if the performance of regional Victoria is even better than we thought it would be, then there is a case to say we can do more. We can change further rules in regional Vic. I'm not announcing that today, but what I was trying to do and what I'm trying to do now is to reassure regional Victorians that we won't have you in these rules for a moment longer than you need to be. Alignment is important because movement's important, but we also know that movement means virus until you've got all of the state to very, very low levels. So there may be some additional things we can do in regional Victoria, but they're not for announcement today, and they'd only be done on public health advice, and they'd only be, for instance, if the low virus status of regional Victoria was maintained for another 10 days, 2 weeks. So that's where getting tested, and to think that even with such low numbers, we had over that 14-day period to last Monday, going on for 2,500 people that got tested, 26,000 people, and just yesterday, almost 2,500 people getting tested. That's a very impressive thing, and it does mean that we'll be able to, particularly with our public health response, keep those regional Victorian numbers low. Metro and regional will have to align at some point, but if there's more we can do in regional Victoria sooner, then we're not ruling that out, and in fact we're looking very closely at that.
Premier, when you go to make your decision or announce your decision on the 19th, what will be the reference period you're using to base that decision on? Will it be up to the 18th or up to the 17th, or the 14-day reference period, I mean, for cases?
It'll be the 14-day period up until the 18th. Could be a day earlier. It just depends when results come in and as they relate to the decision-making process. But it'll be, in general terms, and if we can get you a definitive answer on exactly when the cut-off will be, it's midnight on the Thursday night or something, or whatever it might be, I'm happy to have the team come back. But we've always made a feature of this, not last-minute decision-making, because the work gets done for days and weeks before then, but the finalisation of it needs to be as close to the time when you're announcing it, because that means you've got more data. Now, the issue there, though, is that is even more important when you've got 50 or 100 or 200 cases per day. Once you get down to very small numbers, then you can kind of see some trends emerging, but even then, one mystery case could be enough to mean we had to wait longer. I'm not foreshadowing that. I'm just trying to be as frank as I can be. We will not be making the decision for the 18th this coming weekend. It'll be made as close to the 18th as possible, because that means we'll have more data and a more complete picture, to the extent that you ever get a complete picture with this coronavirus. Bridget.
Is it acceptable that essentially the same cohort of workers that were working in the first failed hotel quarantine system are working in the revamped system? We've seen reports of subcontractors working, and also former pub and club bouncers working in the hotel quarantine system.
Look, I'd need to come back to you and have the Attorney General come back to you in relation to the specifics. The Corrections Commissioner spoke to some of these matters in some detail a week or so ago. Alfred Health may have some further things that they can add to this as well. Staff that are employed by them under arrangements that serve that hospital very well. They're a world leader in infection prevention and control, so they're well and truly across those issues. There was one particular historical case where a person worked at an aged care facility as well. That matter's been dealt with. The broader issues have been dealt with also. I want to stress again, these are not returned travellers from the US or from some other part of the world. These are people who are, in terms of the setting, they have to quarantine. Everyone who's got the virus has to quarantine, but they have voluntarily, and some of them have even sought the support of the state to be in a hotel because it wasn't safe or practical for them to isolate at home. Therefore, the risk is different, the environment is different, whole notions of security and what's appropriate and what isn't, I think, are different to people who not only are being compulsorily quarantined, but they are being essentially held against their will in a particular setting. They're two different cohorts. As to detailed arrangements, I'm more than happy to have the attorney and or Alfred Health come back to you on any of those issues, but I would point out those issues are from some weeks ago, and it's my expectation that is not a feature of the program, regardless of which cohort you're talking about now, indeed for many weeks, and indeed as we look to the future. And whatever that reset, wherever we land on that, which, as I've said a number of times, we're going to wait to see the final report.
There are a ton of people, I'm sure you know this, they feel like they're fraying and they've been able to cope for a long time, but they can't cope now. I had to go for a walk with someone yesterday who's close to me, who's really...
Yeah, it's very tough.
You understand all that.
It's incredibly tough.
I'm not saying you don't understand that, but what would you say to people who feel like they're losing hope? What would you say to them? Well,
I'd say this, I live in a family too, and whilst I don't often spend time at these briefings making it about me, I have not seen my mother since Christmas. That's not good for her, it's not good for me and my kids and our family. I get it at a very deeply personal level. This is a year like no other.
The reason I raise this,
and
people
it's very...
don't think you do. I know you probably get reports of the talkback. People call in and say, he doesn't understand what I'm going through.
Well, look, I'd just say that if people saying that makes them feel a bit better, that's part of the job I've got, right? I'm not being in any way precious about this, and I'm not pleading for sympathy. No. I'm just trying to make the point, as you sort of led me to, that regardless of whether you're the Premier or not, each of us feel this in deeply personal ways. And whilst I'm not comparing the challenges I face to anybody else because they're all unique, it would be wrong to say that I don't understand or don't appreciate. I do. I get this. It is very tough. And that's why for those for whom it is toughest, we have made substantial investments, and we will make further investments, whether it be in drug and alcohol programs, family violence programs, mental health programs, business support, dealing with the most vulnerable in the community who have nowhere to sleep, putting them up in unique circumstances. The list goes on and on. But well beyond that, in some respects, the biggest challenge here are people who would never have considered themselves vulnerable, who now find themselves vulnerable. And all of us are, to a certain extent. We are all feeling this. This is not easy. It's not easy in any way.
So is it
But that's why
possible-
I'm determined. That's why I'm determined, and the team I lead is determined, many, many thousands of people, to make sure that all of that pain and that hurt and that vulnerability counts for something. The last thing here, the last thing any of us need, is to do what's popular, but what's not safe. That just doesn't work. It's got to be done safely, and I would say to all your listeners and to anyone who feels that pain, we are very, very close. This is working. We will have more to say soon, but I think everyone is well acquainted with the notion that this thing is unpredictable and there is that latency. And if I could make definitive announcements today, well, of course I would, but they wouldn't be worth very much because we just don't know for a little bit longer whether we're going to be in a safe space to change some of these rules.
So is it possible that nothing will change on the 19th? Or are we going to get
I think it
at
is
least something?
highly unlikely that nothing will change. There will be some changes. The exact nature of those we will need to look at, and if it's safe to do, we will do whatever's safe. And if that's a big package of changes, well then I'm sure your listeners and all Victorians will welcome that. I know my family will. I know every family will. But what people won't welcome, either from an intellectual point of view or from an emotional point of view really, are steps being taken that are not safe. That just runs the risk of setting us all back. And no COVID normal Christmas, no COVID normal summer, and a 2021 that instead of being vastly different to 2020 is one that potentially can be quite similar. I just don't want that.
Do you think, Premier, that people have got the capacity to endure any more of this if things don't go according to plan over the next 2 weeks?
I think that anybody who underestimates the capacity of the Victorian community is most unwise and hasn't spent much time in this great state. I am so deeply impressed and proud of Victorians who, yes, they're doing it tough, but they know and understand that whilst we have to stay apart, it's the sticking together that sets us apart from so many places in the world. The sticking together is what is really important, and knowing that this is something that we are equal to if we just see this thing through. It's such a deeply impressive thing.
Commissioner Crisp changed his evidence and then put out another statement saying that he made that decision on his own. Does he need to go before PAC to explain those changes verbally?
That's a matter for for the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee in terms of whether they want to hear from him. That's a committee that, it's not a government committee. It's got members of Parliament who take their responsibilities very seriously, and they've got a COVID reference. They'll have the budget process as well coming up quite soon. That's entirely a matter for them.
But should he do it for transparency, given how, I guess, much
Well,
focus is on
I
that
can't
issue?
I can't tell you how many times he's appeared at PAC, but he certainly has in the past. I would have thought that he'd be more than happy. I haven't spoken to him about it, but I would just assume he'd be more than happy to participate in that process if the committee felt that they needed to hear from him.
That committee is Labor dominated, so what would you say to your Labor MPs about
I think I just have
getting
said
him
it.
to come
It's
back?
if the committee makes a judgment that they want to hear from him or any other witness, then no doubt they'll have a view on that.
Just a quick one to Alan.
I appear at it all the time. Not every premier's appeared at it all the time. There's one very famous example of a premier who never went there, never went near it. For 7 years, never went near it. So our commitment, despite the government majority, our credentials, all the ministers turn up, including the Chief Minister. And I'll be back before the committee again soon.
Premier, just a quick one on wedding photos. Are the bride and groom allowed to get their wedding photos?
Yes, I have seen this. I saw one yesterday about birthday cake candles and stuff too. Look, seriously, people are trying to do their best. Common sense needs to guide this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get that matter clarified, and we'll put something out this afternoon. I'm not going to ask Alan to do it on the run. It's been drawn to my attention this morning. I would make the point photographers are not permitted workers, so that's one issue. But a wedding party of such small numbers will be almost certainly from at least one household. Let's try and find something that's safe, but at the same time tries to reflect the very special nature of that day. There are not many of these ceremonies going on at the moment compared to a normal spring, but let's try and do it as safely as we can, again recognising that it is a very special day for everyone that's involved, but I don't think it's beyond us to find that middle ground, but we'll try and put some revised advice that's absolutely crystal clear up through the appropriate channels by the end of today.
And what about regional photographers? Are things slightly different for them? Are they allowed to go?
Yeah, I would assume so. I'm happy to check the status of that, but my advice is that Metropolitan Melbourne, that's not a permitted industry. But again, if there's any need to clean any of that up or clear it up, then we can make that a feature of that update this Arvo.
I just had one for Alan. Just on the rules next week, people going to school, this is from a listener as well. I can't take someone else's kids to school in my car, can I? People have been, organising drop-offs. If they're primary kids, I presume if they're from another household, I can't take them to school in my car?
I think that's correct, but probably just need to make sure that I've got it all right, and we'll clarify that with you.
And just a quick one, maybe Minister, I think, is the new contact tracing software up and running yet? Have you pushed the button to make it go?
So, as you know, National Cabinet took a decision about through the Chief Scientist to work with all the jurisdictions. Victoria had already got out in front of that through the conversations with New South Wales. A key part of that was the introduction of the CRM Salesforce process, and that's intimately linked to the local public health unit rollouts, which in the regions there's 6 up and running. In Metro Melbourne it's 3 or 4, with more to come, and that rollout is happening, and we're quite pleased with that. And the data is being entered straight onto the system, and how that system links and operates carefully. So as it's ramped up, it becomes an end-to-end digital tool is the work that's underway at the moment.
So it is working and doing what it's supposed to do?
It's being tested and ramped up to make sure it does what it's meant to do. And so far, we're pleased with it.
Any update on the mask stockpile? I think I asked last week.
We have millions of masks and PPE equipment in the Victorian warehouse. And not only is it in the warehouse, it's getting out in an increasing timely fashion to our health services, our community health services and other areas. There's always improvements to be made. That's why we have our worker and industry liaison group, both on a technical side and a practical side, and I've sat in on a couple of those meetings in the last few weeks.
The average Victorian, though, Minister?
I beg pardon, Simon?
Are they going out to the average Victorian? I asked the Premier about this last week.
Simon, my apologies if we've not come back to you with an update. I'm more than happy to commit to try and make that a feature of tomorrow or over the weekend. These are I take it you're asking about reusable masks that we procured and we're giving out via various networks, PHNs, councils, community health services, and the like. That was principally for vulnerable Victorians who we thought the difference might be whether they could afford a mask or whether they had the ability to make a mask. Let me get an update for you on that. And we might do, it's probably becoming slightly less acute given the number of people in hospital, but on hospital PPE supplies, I might try and make that a feature of the update as well, just to cover the field on that. You remember a while ago I gave you some breakdowns about when orders are placed, how quickly they're packed and how quickly they get out to hospitals and all of that. We can give you an update on that too.
Just one more on the contact tracing, please, with Kilmore, if you don't mind.
Sure.
In New South Wales, when they've had especially high-profile, high-risk locations like the pub, the Crossroads pub, yes. People were told get a test that stay isolated for 14 days, regardless of the result. So why haven't we adopted that model for a high-risk place like the cafe?
Well, I don't think that it's accurate to say we haven't. So your earlier question was in relation to, say, the 4 of us are at a cafe, one of us tests positive, but we've got no connection other than that cafe. We might be asked to isolate because we could potentially be a close contact of each other. If, however, it turns out that none of you 3 test positive after 3 days, say, then the advice to you about how long you need to isolate and therefore the knock-on to your close contacts and you can take it even further than that, their close contacts from households, for instance, that may well change. And I know it's frustrating if you look at it from a kind of aerial point of view or the aggregate point of view. Okay, a group of people were told one thing on day one, but things change. And as things evolve and other pieces of the puzzle, this is a jigsaw where you don't get given all the pieces when you open the box. You've got to go and search and find them and put the most complete picture together. So advice will change to different people at different times. The key point though is that the link and being able to continually talk to people and update them. I don't want people sitting at home for 14 days when there's no good scientific reason for them to do that. However, getting the balance between doing what's proportionate and necessary, but at the same time having that abundance of caution run through all of your public health response, I think the Kilmore example proves that can be done. Similarly, if you look at Colac, look at the Latrobe Valley, and indeed look at the way Chadstone's been done, I'm sure advice will have changed. That's not a point of concern. That's not inconsistent. That's simply, okay, I now have an extra piece of the jigsaw, and I can update you about where you fit in the overall chain of transmission, what your place and your risk profile toward others is, based on information I didn't have yesterday, but I do have today. That's how it should work. Otherwise, the thing would be completely static, and we'd have, because the thing is this: it's one thing to ask you to stay at home, but we go and check that you are. So if we've got enormous numbers of people that really don't need to be, then that's where your resources get focused, rather than where they should be focused, which is based on the latest intelligence, the latest evidence, the latest science about who's the greatest risk, not just to their very close contacts, but through those networks of movement, networks of human connection, who they pose the greatest risk to for infection and reinfection beyond them. Does that make sense, Noel?
It does make sense. So would that person then, so when the advice changes, would that individual then be told, well, we've had a close test from one of those people that you were hanging out with at the cafe?
Yep.
And then therefore they would know why the advice has changed. Seems less inconsistent, and then they don't have to ring up the radio station and complain.
That is what I believe is happening. Okay. But you are talking about large numbers of people, and they won't necessarily be getting a call, within moments of another piece of the jigsaw puzzle turning up. I think the better example is go one ring further out. So the close contact of someone who we believe is a close contact of the case, if that person were to test negative, then it may well be, not exclusively, but it may well be that person one ring further out would be told, okay, we don't think you need to isolate, or we don't think you need to isolate for the 14 days, but go and get a precautionary test just to basically validate that. So it is a kind of evolving thing, but the changes in advice are all based on the picture becoming more and more complete as the hours and the days go by. That's the only way that you can do it. Otherwise, you'd have your resources allocated in the wrong places. Any other issues? If not, thank you. See you tomorrow.